Welcome back to Key Safety Talks. Today, we're going to be tackling a topic that's really important for anyone working with chemicals,
Yeah,
understanding all the different systems for classifying chemical hazards.
yeah, for sure.
Specifically, we'll be comparing the Globally Harmonized System,
Mm.
which is also known as GHS, and the U.S. Specific Hazard Communication Standard, or HCS.
Right.
You might be thinking, why two systems? Doesn't that just overcomplicate things?
Yeah, you'd be right. It can be a bit of a headache sometimes,
Right.
but understanding the differences between these two systems is, crucial for ensuring workplace
For
safety,
sure.
no matter where you are in the world.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What's the big picture here? Why even have these two systems in the first place?
Well, imagine a world where every country just had its own unique way of labeling and classifying chemicals.
Right.
It would be chaos. GHS was created to address this issue,
Okay.
to provide a common language for chemical safety that could be adopted globally.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly, yeah. Make trading and handling chemicals smoother and safer across borders.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it's like the Esperanto of chemical safety.
Exactly, yeah. Just like Esperanto hasn't exactly taken the world by storm, now every country has fully adopted GHS.
Right.
The US, for example, has its own system, the HCS, which has been around for quite some time.
So we're kind of doing our own thing here in the U.S.?
To a certain extent, yeah.
Okay.
But the US does incorporate elements of GHS into the HCS.
Okay.
However, some key differences still remain,
Okay.
and those differences can have significant implications for how chemicals are handled and communicated about.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is so important.
Yeah.
So what are some of the most fundamental differences between GHS and HCS?
One of the most striking differences lies in how they approach health hazard endpoints.
Okay.
GHS casts a wider net, encompassing a broader range of potential health effects than HCS.
Can you give me a specific example?
Absolutely. Think about mutagenicity,
Okay.
which refers to a substance's potential to cause changes in DNA.
Got it.
GHS has specific categories for this, breaking it down into different levels of concern.
Okay.
HCS, on the other hand, doesn't have a direct equivalent.
So something could be classified as a mutagen under GHS, but not raise any red flags under HCS.
That's right.
Wow.
And that difference in classification could have a big impact on how the chemical is perceived and handled.
For sure.
It could affect everything from labeling to worker training
Right.
to safety protocols.
That's a pretty stark contrast.
It is.
Sounds like GHS is painting a more detailed picture of a chemical's potential hazards.
You could say that, yeah.
Okay.
And that attention to detail extends to how they handle mixtures, which are
Absolutely.
combinations of two or more chemicals.
Okay, so let's talk mixtures. What's the difference in the approach there?
HCS often relies on a general rule of thumb,
Yeah.
the 1% cutoff. Basically, if a hazardous component makes up less than 1% of the mixture, it might not trigger specific labeling requirements for that hazard.
Okay.
Carcinogens, however, get a stricter 0.1% cutoff.
So there's some leniency built into the U.S. system, at least when it comes to mixtures.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
But GHS takes a different approach.
Yeah.
Instead of that blanket cutoff, it uses cutoff values that are specific to each hazard endpoint.
So the cutoff could be 1% for one hazard, 0.5% for another, and so on.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
It all depends on the specific hazard and how potent it is.
Got it.
This means that a mixture that's labeled as a skin irritant under GHS, because it has a certain percentage of a category 2 skin irritant, might not be labeled under HCS because the concentration falls below that 1% threshold.
So it's not just about what hazards are present, but also how much of those hazardous components are in the mix.
Exactly.
And that's where things can get really confusing for companies that operate in the global market.
Precisely. Imagine you're a manufacturer producing a chemical product that needs to be compliant with both GHS and HCS.
Right.
You have to be aware of the nuances of both systems to ensure that your SDSs, labels, and safety protocols are up to snuff.
Okay, so we've talked about endpoints and cutoff values.
Yeah.
What other major differences should our listeners be aware of?
Let's delve into how they tackle acute toxicity, which essentially means how poisonous a substance is after a single exposure.
Okay.
GHS goes into meticulous detail here,
Good.
using a 5-category system to rank toxicity.
5 categories.
Yeah.
That seems pretty intense.
It is.
How do they determine which category a substance falls into?
It all comes down to LD50 and LC50 values.
Okay.
These are measures of how much of a substance it takes to cause death in 50% of a test population.
Got it.
LD50 refers to the lethal dose,
Okay.
usually measured in milligrams of the substance per kilogram of body weight.
Okay.
LC50 is similar,
Yep.
but it refers to the lethal concentration in the air.
So they're basically looking at how much of a substance it takes to be fatal.
Exactly.
Got it.
And depending on those LD50 and LC50 values, a substance is assigned to one of the 5 GHS categories.
Okay.
Category 1 represents the most acutely toxic substances, those requiring only tiny amounts to be lethal,
Wow.
while Category 5 includes substances that are relatively less toxic.
So I'm assuming HCS doesn't go into quite this much detail.
You're right. It doesn't use this 5-category system for acute toxicity.
Got it.
That's another example of where you see a significant difference in the level of detail.
All right, so we're seeing a pattern here.
Yeah.
GHS tends to be much more granular and specific,
Yes.
while HCS takes a broader approach.
You're catching on quickly.
All right, and that pattern continues as we look at other health hazards like skin corrosion and irritation.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about those.
Okay.
When it comes to skin corrosion and irritation, what are the key things we need to know about GHS and HCS?
GHS makes a clear distinction between skin corrosion, which involves irreversible damage to the skin, and skin irritation, which is reversible.
Okay.
It even further subdivides these categories based on how severe and how quickly the effects appear.
So a substance that causes redness that goes away after a few hours would be classified differently from one that causes permanent scarring.
Exactly.
Okay.
And GHS also considers the time frame of those effects.
Okay.
Imagine a substance that causes irreversible damage to the skin after just 4 hours of contact.
Wow.
Under GHS, that would be classified as Category 1, a serious skin corrosive.
Okay.
On the other hand, a substance that causes reversible damage after 4 hours might fall into Category 2, a skin irritant.
So GHS is really taking into account the time frame of those effects, too.
Absolutely.
Yep.
In contrast, HCS has a single category for corrosivity,
Oh, wow.
lumping together both corrosive and irritant effects.
It seems like GHS is really emphasizing the potential for long-term health impacts with its more detailed classifications.
You could say that, yeah.
But it also seems like this could create a lot of complexity for businesses trying to navigate both systems.
You've hit on a key point.
Okay.
While the level of detail in GHS can be incredibly valuable for risk assessment and communication,
Right.
it also adds a layer of complexity.
For sure.
Companies need to be aware of these nuances and ensure they're properly classifying and labeling chemicals under both systems.
I can see how this could be a real challenge,
Yeah.
especially for companies that operate in a global market.
It is.
But before we dive deeper into those challenges, let's take a closer look at some of the other health hazards covered by these systems.
Yeah, sounds good.
After all, we've only just scratched the surface of this topic.
We have.
All right, let's pick up where we left off.
Okay.
We were just starting to explore the fascinating world of chemical hazards and the different ways GHS and HCS classify them.
Right.
We talked about skin corrosion and irritation, but what about our eyes? I'm guessing those are pretty vulnerable too.
Absolutely. Our eyes are incredibly sensitive, and chemical exposure can have, serious consequences from temporary irritation to permanent vision loss.
So how do GHS and HCS approach this hazard?
Well, GHS, being the meticulous system that it is, draws a clear line between serious eye damage,
Okay.
which involves irreversible effects like blindness,
Right.
and eye irritation, which causes temporary discomfort.
Okay.
And as you might expect, it further subdivides these categories based on the severity and duration of the effects.
Okay, so a substance that causes temporary redness would be in a different category than one that could lead to blindness.
Precisely.
Got it.
GHS takes into account factors like how long it takes for symptoms to appear and whether they resolve on their own.
Oh.
For instance, a substance that causes severe eye damage within seconds of contact would be categorized differently from a substance that causes mild reversible irritation after a few hours.
Wow, that level of detail is impressive.
Yeah.
It sounds like GHS is really focused on helping people understand the full range of potential consequences.
Exactly. It's all about providing a clear and comprehensive picture of the hazard.
Right.
And again, this contrasts with HCS, which typically uses a single category to cover both eye damage and irritation.
Okay. Yeah. I'm seeing a theme here.
Yeah.
GHS loves its subcategories and detailed classifications.
Right.
But seriously, it makes sense to have that extra level of detail when dealing with something as sensitive as our eyes.
I agree.
Yeah.
It allows for more targeted risk assessments and preventative
All
measures.
right, let's move on to another hazard. Sensitizers.
Okay.
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure what a sensitizer is. Can you enlighten me?
Of course.
Okay.
Think about the saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right.
Well, that's not always true when it comes to chemicals.
Right.
A sensitizer is a substance that might not cause an obvious reaction the first time you're exposed to it,
Okay.
but with repeated exposure, it can trigger an allergic response.
Like poison ivy. You might not get a rash the first time you brush against it. But subsequent exposures can lead to that awful itching and blistering.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And just like poison ivy can cause skin allergies,
Yeah.
some chemicals can trigger allergic reactions in the airways,
Right.
leading to breathing problems.
So how does GHS handle this sneaky hazard?
GHS distinguishes between respiratory sensitizers, which affect the airways,
Got it.
and skin sensitizers,
Right.
which, as the name suggests, affect the skin.
Makes sense.
It places substances and mixtures into separate hazard categories for each type of sensitization.
So no subcategories this time.
Not for the main categories themselves,
Okay.
but there are specific criteria that determine whether a substance or mixture qualifies as a sensitizer in the first place.
Okay.
These criteria are often based on human data or results from animal tests.
So they're really digging into the scientific evidence to support those classifications.
Exactly.
Got it.
They want to be as sure as possible that a substance is truly a sensitizer before slapping that label on it.
Okay, so GHS is being very thorough.
It is, yeah.
What about HCS? Does it take a similar approach to sensitizers?
HCS does address sensitizers,
Okay.
but it doesn't always draw the same distinctions as GHS.
Okay.
This can lead to situations where a substance is classified as a sensitizer under one system but not the other.
I can see how that could be a problem,
Yeah.
especially for companies trying to comply with both systems.
Right.
It sounds like a real balancing act.
It is.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of understanding the nuances of both GHS and HCS to ensure consistent and effective hazard communication.
All right, let's move on to two hazards that are often linked together. Mutagenicity and carcinogenicity.
Okay.
We touched on mutagenicity earlier,
Yeah.
but can you give us a quick refresher on what it means?
Of course.
Okay.
Mutagenicity refers to a substance's ability to cause mutations or changes in DNA.
Okay.
These changes can sometimes lead to health problems,
Right.
including cancer.
And carcinogenicity is all about a substance's potential to cause cancer, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, GHS takes a very cautious approach to both of these hazards.
Yep.
It has specific categories for mutagens, distinguishing between substances known to cause heritable mutations, meaning they can be passed down to offspring, and those with less conclusive evidence.
So even if the evidence isn't rock solid, they're still flagging those substances as potentially harmful.
Precisely.
Wow. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
When it comes to something as serious as DNA damage, it's better to err on the side of caution.
Absolutely.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
What about carcinogenicity? How does GHS classify those bad boys?
GHS categorizes carcinogens based on the strength of the evidence,
Okay.
dividing them into categories for known or presumed carcinogens and suspected carcinogens.
Okay, so once again, they're breaking it down into categories based on the level of certainty.
Yeah.
What about HCS? How does it handle these hazards?
HCS takes a slightly different tack. Instead of conducting its own evaluations, it often defers to the classifications made by reputable organizations like the International Agency for Research on Cancer,
Okay.
IRC, and the National Toxicology Program, NTP.
Okay.
If a substance is listed as a carcinogen by either of those groups, it's considered a carcinogen under HCS.
So it's kind of like outsourcing the heavy lifting of classification to the experts.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And it highlights another key difference between the two systems.
Okay.
GHS is more proactive in its hazard assessments,
Right.
while HCS often relies on existing classifications.
Okay, so we've talked about mutagens and carcinogens.
Right.
What other hazards should we be aware of?
Up next is a hazard that's particularly important to consider when working with certain groups of people: reproductive toxicity.
Reproductive toxicity.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty serious.
It is.
What exactly does that mean?
It refers to any harmful effect that a substance can have on the reproductive system or on the development of offspring. We're talking about things that could cause infertility, birth defects, miscarriages, or developmental delays.
Wow, that's a heavy hitter.
It is.
So how does GHS approach this sensitive issue?
GHS has two main categories for reproductive toxicity, with subcategories based on the severity of the effects and the strength of the evidence.
Okay.
It takes into account things like whether a substance is known to cause birth defects in humans, or if the evidence is primarily based on animal studies.
It sounds like GHS is really trying to paint a clear picture of the potential risks to reproductive health.
It is, yeah.
What about HCS? Does it have similar categories?
This is where we see a big difference between the two systems.
Okay.
HCS doesn't have separate categories for reproductive toxicity.
Oh, wow.
Instead, it often lumps these effects in with other health hazards,
Really?
which can make it difficult to get a clear picture of the specific risks.
That seems like a pretty significant omission, especially considering the potential long-term consequences.
It's definitely an area where there's room for improvement in the U.S. system.
Yeah.
Many advocates for worker safety have been pushing for more explicit recognition of reproductive hazards within HCS.
It makes sense to me that these hazards should be clearly identified.
Yeah.
After all, protecting future generations is just as important as protecting current workers.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And GHS acknowledges this by including another category that HCS lacks, effects on or via lactation.
Effects on or via lactation, what does that mean?
It refers to substances that can be passed through breast milk and potentially harm a nursing infant.
Okay.
This is a crucial consideration for protecting the health of both mothers and babies.
So GHS is really thinking about those vulnerable populations too.
They are.
It seems like they've really thought of everything.
They've certainly made an effort to create a comprehensive system that addresses a wide range of hazards.
Yeah.
Of course, no system is perfect, but GHS has made significant strides in harmonizing chemical hazard classification and communication on a global scale.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about everything from eye damage to reproductive toxicity.
Right.
But we still have one more major hazard to discuss. Target organ systemic toxicity.
Ah, yes, target organ toxicity, or STOT for short.
Okay.
A bit of a mouthful.
Right.
But it's a crucial concept to understand when dealing with chemical hazards.
All right, so what is STOT? Break it down for me.
STOT refers to the toxic effects that a substance can have on specific organs or systems in the body.
Okay.
Think about it as a chemical's ability to hone in on a particular target, like the liver, kidneys, lungs, or nervous system.
So we're talking about chemicals that can cause damage to specific parts of the body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the tricky thing about STOT is that it can manifest in many different ways, depending on the substance and the route of exposure.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure.
Okay.
Imagine a solvent that primarily affects the liver.
Okay.
Repeated exposure to the solvent could lead to liver damage,
Right.
potentially even cirrhosis.
Wow.
Or think about a heavy metal that targets the nervous system. Exposure to this metal could cause neurological problems like tremors or memory loss.
Wow, that's scary stuff.
It can be.
So how does GHS deal with STOT? Does it have separate categories for different target organs?
GHS doesn't categorize STOT based on the specific target organ.
Okay.
Instead, it focuses on the route of exposure and whether the effects occur after a single exposure or repeated exposures.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Okay.
What do you mean by route of exposure?
The route of exposure refers to how a substance enters the body.
Okay.
It could be through inhalation.
Okay, breathing it in.
Yeah, breathing it in
Oh,
dermal
good.
contact,
Like getting on your skin.
getting on your skin, or
that.
ingestion,
Swallowing it.
swallowing
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
So GHS considers whether the STOT occurs after, say, inhaling a chemical once versus being exposed to it through your skin on a daily basis.
You got it.
Okay.
And for both single and repeated exposures.
GHS has two main categories. Category 1 for substances that cause significant toxicity, and Category 2 for those that are harmful.
Okay, so it's a two-tiered system based on the severity of the effects.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
What about HCS? Does it take a similar approach?
HCS does address target organ effects,
Okay.
but it doesn't always distinguish between single and repeat exposures like GHS does.
Okay.
This can sometimes lead to discrepancies in how a substance is classified under the two systems.
I can see how that could be a problem for companies trying to ensure they're compliant with both sets of regulations.
It is.
It seems like having a deep understanding of the nuances of both systems is essential for effective hazard communication and risk management.
I agree.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that we're talking about real-world implications here.
Right.
These differences in classification and communication can directly impact worker safety.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's all about protecting people from harm.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And while GHS and HCS might have their differences, they both share the same goal: to make workplaces safer by providing clear and consistent information about chemical hazards.
Okay, so welcome back to Key Safety Talks.
Yeah.
We've spent the last 2 segments of this episode really diving deep into GHS and HCS,
We have.
exploring how they classify all these different chemical hazards. But I think it makes sense now to sort of like shift gears and talk about how these systems, how they translate into real-world action.
Yeah.
What does all this mean for someone who's like, working with chemicals like day in and day out?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about making informed decisions to protect yourself and your colleagues.
Yeah.
These systems provide the framework for understanding the hazards,
Right.
communicating those hazards effectively,
Uh,
and then implementing the right safety measures.
so it's not just about like memorizing all the categories and subcategories.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to like create a safer work environment.
Exactly. Think of it like this. GHS and HCS are like the blueprints for building a safe and hazard-free workplace.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So if these systems are like the blueprint,
Right.
what are the building blocks of a safe workplace? What are like the key elements that we need to focus on?
Yeah, let's start with, safety data sheets,
Okay.
or SDSs.
Right.
These documents are like the instruction manuals for handling hazardous chemicals safely.
Okay.
Both GHS and HCS require manufacturers to provide SDSs.
Okay.
But as we've discussed, there can be differences in, the level of detail and the specific information included.
Right. We talked about how, GHS SDSs tend to be more comprehensive
Yeah.
with more subcategories and finer distinctions between hazards.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you're used to working with HCS SDSs, you might be surprised by the amount of information packed into a GHS SDS.
Oh, wow.
For example, a GHS SDS might provide specific details about target organ toxicity,
Okay.
outlining which organs are most likely to be affected and what the potential long-term effects might be.
Got it.
An HCS SDS, on the other hand,
Mhm.
might simply offer a general warning about the possibility of target organ effects.
So someone reading a GHS SDS
Mm-hmm.
would get a much more like granular understanding of the risks.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that's why it's crucial for workers to be trained on how to read and understand both GHS and HCS SDSs.
Okay.
They need to know where to find the key information and how to interpret it in the context of their specific work environment.
Okay. SDSs are essential,
Yeah.
but they're not the only tool in the safety toolbox.
No, for sure.
What about labeling?
Right.
We talked earlier about how GHS and HCS might have different cutoff values for mixtures,
Right.
potentially leading to different labeling requirements. How can we like navigate that complexity?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Labeling is often the first line of defense when it comes to chemical safety.
Cool.
It provides a quick and easy way to identify hazards
Okay.
and understand the basic precautions needed to handle a substance safely.
Right.
But, as we've discussed,
Yeah.
the differences between GHS and HCS can create some confusion when it comes to labeling.
Right. We talked about how like a mixture that's considered a skin irritant under GHS
Yeah.
might not require that same labeling under HCS
Right.
if the concentration of the irritant falls below the 1% threshold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this discrepancy can have real-world consequences.
For sure.
Imagine a worker who's used to handling a particular mixture that's labeled as a skin irritant under HCS.
Right.
If they encounter the same mixture labeled under GHS, they might not realize that it still poses a risk of skin irritation.
So even though the chemical itself hasn't changed, the labeling differences could lead to a false sense of security.
That's the danger.
Wow.
And that's why it's so important for workers to be aware of these nuances.
Okay.
And to understand that a lack of a particular hazard warning on a label
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean that the substance is completely harmless.
Okay, so we need to be really careful about interpreting labels and not make assumptions based on what we're used to seeing.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's always best to err on the side of caution and consult the SDS if you have any doubts about the hazards associated with a particular substance.
Great advice. So we've talked about SDSs and labeling.
Yeah.
But what about the bigger picture?
Mm-hmm.
How can we create a workplace culture
Right.
that truly prioritizes safety?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
It's not enough to simply have the right documents and labels in place.
Right.
You need to foster an environment where safety is everyone's responsibility.
Okay, so how do we do that? What are the key ingredients of a strong safety culture?
Well, communication is paramount.
Okay.
Workers need to feel comfortable reporting potential hazards, near misses, or any safety concerns they might have.
Okay.
They need to know that their concerns will be taken seriously
Uh-huh.
and that there will be no repercussions for speaking up.
So it's about creating an open and transparent environment where people aren't afraid to raise their hand if they see something that doesn't seem right.
Exactly.
Got it.
And it's also about providing workers with the knowledge and skills they need to work safely.
Okay.
Training is essential, and it should be tailored to the specific hazards present in the workplace.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, not at all.
The training needs to be relevant to the tasks and substances workers are dealing with on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it's not just about initial training. Refresher courses and ongoing education are crucial to keep safety top of mind and ensure that workers stay up to date on any changes to regulations or best practices.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
After all, safety is an ongoing process, not a one-time event.
I agree.
What else can employers do to promote a strong safety culture?
Another important aspect is empowering workers to take ownership of their own safety and the safety of their colleagues. This means encouraging them to actively participate in safety meetings, suggest improvements to procedures, and report any potential hazards they observe.
So it's about moving beyond a top-down approach to safety.
Exactly.
And creating a more collaborative environment.
Precisely.
Okay.
When workers feel like they have a voice and that their input is valued, they're more likely to be engaged in safety initiatives and take proactive steps to prevent accidents.
I can see how that would make a big difference.
Yeah.
When people feel like they're part of the solution, they're more likely to be invested in making things better.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's also important to recognize and reward safe behaviors.
Okay.
This could involve something as simple as verbal praise or as formal as a safety award program.
Got it.
The key is to show workers that their efforts to maintain a safe work environment are appreciated.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of communication, training, and empowering workers. Are there any other, key elements of a strong safety culture?
Another crucial aspect is having clear and consistent procedures for handling hazardous chemicals.
Okay.
This includes everything from storage and transportation to use and disposal. Workers need to know exactly what to do in every situation to minimize the risk of exposure or accidents.
So it's about taking the guesswork out of safety.
Exactly.
Okay.
Clear procedures help to ensure that everyone is on the same page and that tasks are performed consistently, reducing the potential for errors or oversights.
That makes a lot of sense. Are there any resources or tools that employers can use to develop and implement these procedures?
Absolutely.
Okay.
OSHA's website is a treasure trove of information on chemical safety.
Okay.
They have guidance documents on everything from hazard communication to developing safety programs.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And there are many professional organizations like the American Industrial Hygiene Association that offer training and resources on chemical safety best practices.
Exact.
Perfect. We'll make sure to include links to those resources in the show notes.
Sounds good.
Any other tips for our safety-conscious listeners?
One final thought. Remember that safety is an ongoing journey, not a destination.
Okay.
It requires constant vigilance, adaptation, and a willingness to learn and improve.
Right.
Stay curious, stay informed, and stay committed to creating a workplace where everyone goes home safe at the end of the day.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining us on Key Safety Talks for this look into the world of GHS and HCS.
My pleasure.
It's been a long and winding road, but hopefully our listeners have gained a better understanding of these two important systems.
Yeah.
And how they can be used to build a safer and healthier work environment.
For sure.
Until next time, stay safe.